All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the book of Genesis. In this recording, we're looking at Genesis 12 through 15. It's our second run at this section of chapters. In our first recording, we gave a little bit of background to Abraham and a bit of an overview of Genesis 12 through 15. In this recording, we want to just give you a few key details out of these chapters as we walk down through it to understand these chapters well and to hear it well. Now, just remember where we're at in the flow of the biblical story. Chapters 1 through 11 is essentially sort of like the introduction, almost like a prologue to the entire story of the Bible, demonstrating or showing how sin and death entered into God's good world. It really raises the problem that the biblical story is going to address. And that problem is sin and death and human wickedness and evil. So chapters 1 through 11 has detailed how that entered into the world, how it spread throughout the world, how God initially addressed it in the cleansing flood and the flood of judgment that came in the days of Noah, how God promised not to do that again. And yet after Noah, we're still right back to sin and death. And so as we turn the page to chapter 12, we move into the next phase of the biblical story, and that phase is, how is God going to solve this problem of sin and death? And we noted that the way God chooses to do it is, at least here in the beginning, is through an ancient Near Eastern man and his wife who can't have kids. And so just to recall the essence of these four chapters, Genesis 12 through 15, chapter 12 is God's initial call to Abraham and his promise to Abraham, as well as Abraham's then initial obedience and leaving Haran and going to Canaan. That's chapter 12. Chapter 13 is where Abraham and Lot separate, and Lot moves to the east. Abraham stays in the west, and God reaffirms his promise of offspring and land to Abraham. Then chapter 14, we get this episode where Lot is captured by invading warlords. Then he's rescued by Abraham, and Abraham is blessed by a priest named Melchizedek. That's chapter 14. And then in chapter 15, God restates his promise to Abraham and actually makes a covenant or a treaty with him to guarantee his promises to Abraham. So that's the overview. That's where we're at. Now let's jump in and walk down through these chapters and hit a few of the key details. Genesis chapter 12 opens like this. Now, the Lord said to Abram. Recall at the end of chapter 11, we met Abram because he was part of Terah's household, and Terah and Abram and Nahor and Sarah and Lot all packed up, left moved to Haran. So that's why we can pick up here with, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your relatives and your father's house, the Bet Av. We talked about the centrality of the father's house, how it was your security and your identity. So the call here to Abraham, stated as it is at the beginning of Genesis 12, is to leave his clan, which meant leaving his identity and his security and his future protection for not only himself, but his household and his family and provision. Leave all of that, God calls to Abraham and tells him, and go to the land which I will show you. And then God states the initial promises, and I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And notice this centrality of the idea of blessing, right? There's no mistaking that blessing is central to God's call to Abraham. And the point seems to be at this juncture in the plot line of the Bible that to be blessed is, and to be a blessing is to undo the curse of Genesis chapter 3. There's a curse on the world because of sin and death, but God's going to undo the curse through Abraham by making him a blessing and by blessing him. And so God intends to bring all his goodness to bear on Abraham's behalf, but not for Abraham's sake alone. Notice the last line where in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So although God is calling one family, which will become one nation, the nation of Israel, God's goal is for all the families of the earth to be blessed right from the get-go. So God's call of Abraham is for the sake of all the peoples of the earth. So verse 4, Abraham obeyed. He went away just as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. So Abraham and Lot leave Haran, head southwest into Canaan. Now, we get a chronological marker. Now, Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, all their possessions they had accumulated, and all the people which they had acquired, which had become a part of their Bet-Av, their household in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And so they came into the land of Canaan. So they made the trek, the journey down to Canaan, and they arrived with as this household, this family, with all their possessions and all their people. And Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem. Again, it would do you well to get out a map, figure out where Shechem is, to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanites were in the land at that time. And, verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants. Remember, he doesn't have any yet. He has no offspring yet. To your offspring, I will give this land. So Abram built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. So God, here in this moment, they've made the trek down to Canaan, and God reaffirms the promise of offspring. To your offspring, I'm going to give this land. So he reaffirms the promise of offspring and the promise of land. And the mention of the Canaanites living in the land at the time gives the reason why there's a delay in receiving the land, and that eventually the Canaanites are going to move out. Abraham and his descendants, his offspring, are going to possess the land. Well, Abram continues moving south like a Bedouin nomad through the land of Canaan. So chapter 12, verse 8, then he, that is Abram, proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And once again, there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And so, once again, he pauses and he formally calls upon and worships the Lord. Now, as he continues southward, he moves towards the southern end of Canaan. So we read in verse 9, then Abram journeyed on, continuing towards the Negev. The Negev is a very dry desert region to the south, in the southern end of the land. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a time, because the famine was severe in the land. Now just pay attention to this little bit of the plot line, because you'll hear an echo, an allusion to this towards the end of the book of Genesis, when Jacob and his family move into the land of Egypt because there's a famine in the land. And so we begin to get sort of these narrative echoes throughout the book of Genesis. And here we get this one. Abram moves down to Egypt. There's a famine in the land. It's severe. And it came about when he was approaching Egypt that he said to his wife Sarai, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well for me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. So now it came about when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman, Sarai, was very beautiful. And Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Therefore, he treated Abram well for her sake, and he gave him sheep and oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. And so Pharaoh ends up giving all this property and possession to Abram for the sake of Sarai, as a way, kind of almost like a bride price. We're not sure if that's exactly what he was thinking, but it's that sort of thing. Now, here's the interesting thing. Sarai is in her mid to upper 60s at this time. She's an older woman. And that should cause us to pause and say, okay, so what is meant by the word beautiful? And what we need to realize is that word is used in a broader sense than the way it's typically used in my culture here in America, where the beautiful are the young, attractive women or something like that. This word is actually used in a variety of contexts, and here it probably communicates something like striking. She was a striking woman in her mid-60s, not only attractive, but also a woman of means. It's clear that Abram is a man of means and wealth. So Sarai, as his believed to be sister, is viewed as a woman that's striking in the sense of maybe her physical appearance, but also in the sense of what she has to offer. She's a powerful, wealthy woman, part of this bet of Abraham. But the Lord struck Pharaoh. So Abram's treated well because of Sarai, but the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called to Abram and said, "What is this that you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her for myself as a wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. You see, what God is doing here is, it's not arbitrary. He's protecting and preserving the line of promise. The line of promise is going to be through Abram and Sarai. And God, in sending these plagues upon Pharaoh, is actually a way of preserving the line of promise and sending Sarai back to where she belongs. Once again, notice the mention of plagues, and you should think then about the echo of the Exodus, where Abraham's descendants will leave Egypt after plagues, and Pharaoh will send them away with all that they had possessed. And so we're setting up the stage for the story to come. So Abraham left Egypt, headed north back into the land that God had promised to give to his offspring. So chapter 13, Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot went with them. And Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold. And he went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been pitched at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, where he had made an altar there, the place that we had read about in chapter 12, where he called upon the Lord. And so he did that again. He called upon the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. He was developing his own family and household, and the land couldn't support both of them while they were living together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was actually strife between Abraham's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen. Now the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, "Please, let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we're brothers, we're relatives. Yes, we've been together on this, and yes, you're developing your own household, but we're from one family, so no tension, no strife. Is the entire land not before you? Please separate from me. If you choose to the left, then I will go to the right. If you choose the right, I will go to the left." And so Abraham is recognizing that they can't continue together. The land can't support them. Lot's own household is now growing and becoming large, and they need to separate. And they need to become two different households completely. And so Lot is going to choose which direction he goes. And so verse 10, Lot raised his eyes, saw all the vicinity of the Jordan River area off towards the east, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt going towards Zoar. So it looked beautiful. It was a well-watered region. So Lot chose for himself the vicinity of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. And this choice makes perfect sense from a human standpoint. It was a well-watered valley, but journeying to the eastward, going east of the Jordan, he has left the land promised to Abraham. And the mention of eastward probably is a bit of a hint, like a portent of what's to come in the story for Lot, because east is not only a literal direction, it's also in the story the direction away from the Lord. Adam and Eve went out of the Garden of Eden to the east. The Tower of Babel happens in the east. So the mention of east here, eastward for Lot, probably signals, things are not going to go well for Lot. So they separated from one another. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the vicinity of the Jordan and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now, the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked sinners against the Lord. Again, that's important. Where he's already going to the east. Now he's in the vicinity of Sodom. We'll see what happens over the course of time in the story. So Lot has taken his household, moved to the east. God then once again reaffirms the promise to Abraham. So verse 14 says, "The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, 'Now raise your eyes and look from the place where you are. Look northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. And I will make your offspring as plentiful as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can count the dust of the earth, then your descendants could be counted. Arise, walk about in the land through its length and its width, for I will give it to you.'" And so God has reaffirmed this promise of the land and told Abram, this is the land that you're going to inherit. Your offspring are going to live here. Then Abram moved his tent and came and lived by the oaks of Mamre, which is the name of a person. So these were apparently some oaks that were part of his property, which are in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. Hebron is a little ways south of Jerusalem at the northern edge of the Negev desert region. It's probably Abram moved there so that there was ample grazing land for Abraham's flocks. And so he pitches his tents in that region. And then what we are told is a story that leads up to Abraham being blessed by Melchizedek. So I'm going to summarize it because we don't have time to read all of it. But here is in a nutshell what happens. The 5 kings of the city-states in the area where Lot has settled, Sodom, Gomorrah, and those city-states. Well, the 5 kings of those city-states revolt against the king who has been their overlord. This leads to a battle where that king marshals some other forces to join with him, and they fight against these 5 kings in that plain where Lot is settled. And the battle that ensues leads to those kings who rebelled. They were defeated, and Lot himself was taken captive as part of the conquering prisoner of war and all of that. Well, Abram is eventually notified that his nephew has been captured. So he rallied his men, 318 of them. Again, that tells us how large his household is and how powerful Abram has become. So he rallied 318 of his men and set out to rescue Lot. And we pick up in verse 14 where it says, "When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan." Dan is actually quite a ways to the north. So they are pursuing well to the north. When Abram finally arrived near Dan, where Lot was being held and where these people were actually at, he divided his forces. He then pursued them further, clear up, it says, to Hobah, which is north of Damascus, way up north in modern-day Syria. And he conquered them and brought back all the possessions, brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, also the women and the other people. And so Abram comes to his defense. He fights off the enemy, rescues Lot, and rescues everything that has been taken captive from the region where Lot had been living. And after rescuing Lot and the others, he is met by a man named Melchizedek, who is a priest and a king in Salem. Salem is short for Jerusalem. And so he is the king of the city-state at Salem, as well as the priest there, priest of the one true God. It says this in Verse 17, then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him, that is Abram, at the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was also a priest of God Most High. Just a real passing little historical note. I will actually put a link to this in the study hub, but recent archaeological work in Jerusalem has found the remains of a temple from this very same time period, roughly this time period of Abraham, that's not a Canaanite temple. It's a monotheistic temple, and it dates from the time period of Abraham, which is at least supportive of the idea that in the area of Jerusalem, they were monotheistic worshipers of who they understood to be the one true God. Totally fits in with what we know about Melchizedek from this story. And so Melchizedek comes out, he's a king and he's a priest, and Melchizedek, blessed him, that is Abraham, and said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has handed over your enemies to you. And then he, that is Abraham, gave a tenth of the spoils of war to Melchizedek. Now, this story is recounted famously in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, and it is shown how Melchizedek is sort of like a kind of a predecessor, if you will, a narrative type or picture or analogy for the Messiah himself, who is both a king and a priest and all of that. And so you can read more about Melchizedek in the book of Hebrews. But this is, aside from where he's mentioned in Psalm 110, this is the only mention of Melchizedek in the entire Old Testament. And this is where we learn who he is. And so he comes out, blesses Abraham. Abraham pays him a tenth from the spoils of war. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, give the people to me and take the possessions for yourself. So he's saying, spare the people, give them to me. You can have all the treasures that you took back, all the possessions you took. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I've sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, so that you do not say, I've made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let them take their share. And so Abram refuses to take anything from the king of Sodom so that he's not indebted to him, and so that the king of Sodom can't claim any sort of authority or power over Abram, or can't take any credit for Abraham's wealth and his blessings. He refuses that. Then, as we turn the page from chapter 14 and move into chapter 15, we come to a very key moment in the life of Abraham, and as well as in the biblical story. So chapter 15 opens by saying, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, Lord God, what will you give me, since I am childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in his house. Abram also said, since you have given me no son, one who is born in my house is an heir. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. So it's not just going to be a servant born in your house, but you will actually conceive a child from your own body. He will be the heir. And God took Abram outside and said, now look towards the heavens and count the stars if you're able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And so God is once again reaffirming his promise to Abram of offspring too numerous to count. How does Abram respond to this? Well, verse 6 is a critical verse. You should mark Genesis 15:6, critical verse in the through line of the Bible, the story of the Bible. It says this, then he, that is Abram, believed in the Lord, and he, God, credited it to him as righteousness. This passage describes how people enter into a right relationship with God. This is what God is looking for: faith, trust, people believing God, taking him at his word, and trusting him. And that's what Abraham did. And so this passage becomes central to the biblical story as that story moves forward about the nature of faith and the importance of faith. Even into the New Testament, we hear the story of Abraham and Abraham's faith. And so Abram believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He's put into a right relationship with God. He's counted as righteous because of his trust in Yahweh. Then God reaffirms the land promised to him. He said to him in verse 7, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. But he said, Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? So God reaffirms the land promise. I brought you out of your hometown here so that I can give you this land. Abram's like, how will I know? And so God guarantees his promise to Abraham by making a covenant, or literally cutting a covenant, because that's how covenants were made in the ancient world. You didn't just make one, you cut a covenant. And you'll see the significance of that word cutting in what follows. Verse 9, so he, God, said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So bring all these animals. And then he brought all these to God and cut them in half, cut them in two, cutting a covenant. And he laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. And birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. And the significance of this, the idea of cutting a covenant, is basically, I guarantee my promise, my word to you, whether it's in this context of the Lord to Abram, or whether it's a king to somebody else. When you made a covenant, you cut it because you're guaranteeing that you're going to keep it on the pangs of death. Now, here's what happens. Usually you would cut a covenant like this, and the weaker party in the covenant is going to walk through between the halves of these animals. It's called walking the blood trail because of the blood from the halves of the animal. And you're going to walk through this. And usually it's the weaker party who walks through that. And essentially what they're saying is, I will keep this treaty that I'm making with you upon pangs of my own death should I fail to keep the terms of this covenant. But watch what happens in the case of the covenant God is making with Abraham. Now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. In his dream, as he sees this vision, right, he feels the sense of foreboding and doom, right? Great darkness fell upon him. Then God said to Abram, know for certain that your offsprings will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. We're looking forward to Israel in Egypt and being foreigners in that land and eventually becoming slaves. That's what God is saying. That's going to happen. They're going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs. But I will also judge the nation whom they serve, the nation of Egypt, and afterwards they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. That is, you shall die. You will be buried at a good old age. And then in the 4th generation, they, your offspring, will return here to this land that I'm promising you, for the wrongdoing, the wickedness, the lawlessness of the Amorite is not yet complete. So it's going to be a while. It's going to be several centuries. That's what he's telling Abraham. But it's going to happen. And part of the reason for the delay is the sin of the Amorite isn't yet filled up. It hasn't piled up high enough. God's not ready to judge all the Canaanites yet because the sin hasn't gotten piled high enough yet. Now it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, a smoking oven and a flaming torch appeared, which passed between the pieces of the animals. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, so this smoking oven and this flaming torch are visual symbols of the Lord himself. And the Lord's walking the blood path. He himself is walking it. And then he says, to your descendants, I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite, the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. I've given it all to you, Abraham. And God himself walks between the animals, basically saying, on the pain of death, I will fulfill my promise to you. And he puts himself on the line and guarantees for Abram that he's going to keep his promises to him. So as we wrap up our recordings on this section of the book of Genesis, just a few theological reflections here. The first is God's promise of blessing. That gets stated in chapter 12 to Abram, and it's restated throughout in various ways. When God reaffirms his promise, God is promising to bring his blessing not only to Abraham and to Abraham's offspring, but ultimately to all the families of the earth. And the significance of that in the flow of the story of the Bible is that that promise of blessing is a promise to undo, to reverse, if you will, the curse of Genesis chapter 3, the curse that lies upon the earth, the curse related to sin and death. God's going to bring his blessing to the world. That's ultimately going to be the way he redeems and restores and undoes the curse of sin and death. Another theological reflection that's important here is God's faithfulness to his promise. From Genesis chapter 12 to Genesis 15, this bit of the story is 10 years. We've covered 10 years from God's initial promise in Genesis 12 to the reaffirmation of that promise with this covenant in Genesis 15. And there's going to be another 15 years until the initial fulfillment of it when Abraham finally has a son with Sarah. So think of that, 10 years, then 15 years, and yet God cut a covenant with Abraham guaranteeing that he would do what he promised to do. So yes, God's not in a hurry. Yes, God takes his time, but God is faithful to his promise to Abraham and his promises to the whole world through Abraham. God was faithful then, he's been faithful now, and he'll continue to be faithful. That's who God is. And one other theological reflection that I think we should look at out of this is where the focus is on God and his promise. We do get this response of Abraham where he responds in faith. God tells him to leave Haran. God hears the word, believes it, obeys. God tells him that he's going to have descendants like the stars of the sky, and Abraham believed God. Okay, I don't have any kids yet. My wife and I are getting old. It's been a decade since you last promised that. And yet I believe you, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And this faith of Abraham becomes central not only to the what we see in the Bible, but central to the experience of the people of Israel and the followers of Jesus. In fact, the story of Abraham is retold or brought up multiple times in the New Testament as this paradigm, this pattern of faith and faithfulness. And that's what God is looking for from his people. And that's how people are counted righteous. And you get that complete exposition of this in Romans chapter 4. Romans 4:1 says, what then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh, has found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And so you get Genesis 15:6 being quoted there in Romans chapter 4. And then the rest of Romans 4 is really an exposition of that line. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. In fact, Romans 4 ends emphasizing how even towards the end of his life, and when it had been a long time, Abraham didn't waver in unbelief, it says. And so Romans chapter 4 reminds us that Abraham is really the pattern, the paradigm of what faithfulness looks like for the people of God. And all of this then points forward to Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment of that seed promise to Abraham. Who is the the ultimate offspring of Abraham? Well, it's Jesus, the Messiah. And you can read what Paul writes in Galatians chapter 3, how he, in that chapter, lays out this whole idea of the promise to Abraham and Abraham's faith and how that came before the Torah, and how then ultimately it narrows down to not just offspring in the sense of Israel, but one specific Israelite, one specific descendant of Abraham, Jesus himself, where Paul says in Galatians 3, it doesn't say seeds as in plural, but seed as singular. That is Jesus, the Messiah. And so the story of Abraham is the foundational story for the entire biblical story that finds its climax and its culmination in Jesus, the Messiah, the ultimate offspring of Abraham. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the book of Genesis. The Listener's Commentary is made possible simply because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people who support this ministry and who faithfully donate and pray for this ministry. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, and you have two options. You can just sign up for the study hub right there, pick a dollar amount, and set up your donation through the study hub, or you can click the give button, which will take you to my page at World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit. If you want the nonprofit tax benefit of that, then go through the give button, and you can set up a recurring monthly donation right there, or you can set up a one-time donation as well. Thanks a ton for your support.